Good evening, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this video and this little topic that I found very particularly interesting. And I've been actually meaning to do a topic like this for quite a while. I even thought about maybe possibly coming out with a top 10 list, possibly the top 10 most overrated fighters in boxing history, in my personal view. But anyways, I thought that I would kind of start off with this, and if any of you guys, of course, are interested in a list like that, you certainly can let me know down in the comment section below, and maybe we'll do that a little bit later on. I will be trying to make certain adjustments to my channel, trying to update it a little bit, but of course I'll have to do that when I have a little bit more time. But anyways, we'll see what happens. But anyways, Dante's Boxing Nation, who of course is a channel that I like to review quite a bit, because I think that he can bring up certain good points, but a lot of the times, once again, in my view, I think it takes it way, way, way too far, especially with certain racial narratives, racial motivations, and on top of that, just certain double standards that he has, and he just goes way, way, way too far with it, especially with the fighters that he tends not to like. And of course, we all know that the fighter that he loves to hate, Mr. Soul Canelo Alvarez, that he comes up in his topics at least once every couple of days, if not at times once a day. So it just is what it is. But anyways, Dante's Boxing Nation is going to talk about a recent podcast where Teddy Atlas said that he believes that Canelo Alvarez, that he believes that he was always a little bit overrated. And he believes that Canelo Alvarez is the most overrated fighter of today. Now, do I personally agree with that statement? Well, it depends what perspective you're talking about. Do I believe that Canelo Alvarez is the most overrated fighter of all time? And I don't think that Teddy Atlas actually said that about Canelo Alvarez. I think that that's more of Dante's words and more of his persuasion. But do I believe that Canelo Alvarez is the most overrated fighter of today? I don't think that I would say that, but what I will say is this. If you still have him as the number one pound for pound fighter, I can see why. But in my view, his spot is starting to dwindle. And you can tell that, in my view, that Canelo Alvarez, that he clearly is slowing down as a fighter. I was questioning, that narrative kind of in the first place because I said, okay, well, maybe against Gennady Golovkin, he had a little bit of problems because that was a trilogy fight and against a fighter that gave him a lot of issues in the previous two fights. Plus, he recently came off of a loss. And in Dmitry Bivol, he looked like he had no stamina after round four. And that was always a fight that I said was going to be very dangerous for him in the first place. But I don't think that there's any doubt about it. In that John Ryder fight, Canelo Alvarez, I'm not going to say he looked like a complete shell of himself, but he doesn't really look like the same fighter anymore. And one could say that he looks like a shell of himself, because in my view, he looked slower, he looked more lethargic, he looked more hittable. You can tell that some of the skill set is still there, but in my view, he does not look like the same fighter. But anyways, this is also going to give me an opportunity. It's also going to give me an opportunity, to talk about, in my view, who the most overrated fighters are of today, possibly the most underrated fighters, and on top of that, who the most overrated fighters are of all time, in my personal view. But anyways, when it comes down, and we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about, in my view, where Canelo Alvarez ranks in terms of the all-time great Mexican fighters. Which, of course, Dante does not refer to Canelo Alvarez as an all-time great Mexican fighter. Not only is he an all-time great Mexican fighter, he is an all-time great fighter. It just is what it is. But anyways, Dante's going to talk about it. I'm going to tune in. It's going to be very interesting.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So Teddy Atlas, he comes out and he reveals who the most overrated fighter in the sport of boxing is today. Do you guys want to guess who he gave the award to? It might surprise some of you guys. Well, by unanimous decision.
Well, it doesn't really surprise me at all, because it's no offense against Teddy Atlas, but it's very clear that for whatever reason, I don't know what quarrel he really has with Canelo Alvarez, but he never really has liked Canelo Alvarez like that. He just hasn't. He hasn't really liked him in a very long time, and it may be because of the machine that they were trying to create with Gennady Triple G Golovkin, and Canelo ended up getting that robbery draw over him in the first fight, and then in the second fight, he ended up beating him, which, it is what it is, but for whatever reason, Teddy Atlas has never liked Canelo Alvarez. I really overall don't know what the deal is, but it just is what it is. He's never liked him. So like I said, I don't mind Teddy Atlas, but he reminds me of the Skip Bayless of boxing. He brings up some points that I think are right on the money, and certain, truths that not a lot of other people are willing to admit because they're afraid of how they may look in terms of professionalism. Even though some of those things may have to be stated. And then there's other times where I think that, he clearly has a bias afoot. That's what he reminds me of. He reminds me a lot of Skip Bayless. It is what it is. But anyways, do I agree that Canelo is the most overrated fighter of today? No, I don't personally agree with that. If you're asking me who do I believe is the most overrated fighter of today, it depends on which list we're talking about. If you're talking about the new media / LDBC list with their type of media, the two most overrated fighters of today are probably Jermell Charlo and Terrence Bud Crawford. And certain people will say, well, why would you say that those two fighters are the most overrated on the pound for pound list? Because they have results, they've been unified champions and blah, blah, blah. Because if you're going to criticize Canelo Alvarez and some of these other fighters for allegedly not fighting elite level fighters, who is Jermell Charlo and Terrence Bud Crawford especially? Who have they ever really fought in their career to really claim themselves as a debatable number one pound for pound fighter? Now, I don't think that anyone's really claimed that Jermell Charlo is the number one pound for pound fighter. I mean, maybe Champ side or something like that. I don't know. But I've already stated this. There's really no logical way, at least in my view, that Jermell Charlo was really a top 10, or excuse me, a top 5 pound for pound fighter. Because when you talk about top 5, you're talking about Canelo, you're talking about Usyk, you're talking about Fury, you're talking about Spence, and you're talking about Terrence Bud Crawford. And some would even debate that Terrence Bud Crawford doesn't even truly deserve to be up there. I have him up there because of his skill set and because he beat at least a couple debatable A-grade names like Gamboa and Porter. I also have him up there because, of course, his great work within 3-weight divisions, or at least 2-weight divisions. But when it comes down to it, Terrence Bud Crawford, if we're really going to talk about his career, people try to say that he's the definitive number one pound for pound fighter, the actual number one pound for pound fighter of today. Well, once again, what ends up happening if Terrence Bud Crawford ends up going into that Errol Spence Jr. fight and he ends up getting knocked out? He'll have no definitive A-grade wins in his career. I mean, the biggest win of his career will be over Sean Porter, and he'll have lost that big fight. So the point that Dante always tries to make about certain fighters like Canelo, like, oh, well, you can't even count their wins over Lara and Golovkin because they're controversial, blah, blah, blah. Even though his bitch ass, even though he tried to say that Golovkin lost twice or that it should have been a draw in the first fight, when it came down to it. But now all of a sudden Canelo was ranked number one pound for pound. Now all of a sudden it goes against Canelo. Once again, Dante is no better than old media or any other fanboy out there. But like I said, the most overrated fighters on their pound for pound list are Jermell Charlo and Terrence Bud Crawford. And Jermell Charlo, for his sake, he just has not fought any definitive A-grade fighters other than Brian Castano. And people try to say that he's top 5 pound for pound. Well, apparently Lomachenko was so overrated and some of these other fighters were so overrated because they already had a loss on their resume. Jermell Charlo just a couple years ago lost to like a C-grade level fighter, dude, and Tony Harrison. He lost to a C-grade level fighter, barely beat him in the rematch, and then should have probably clearly lost against a fighter in Brian Castano. So I just never understood this narrative of, oh, Canelo is overrated because, he should have lost to Gennady Golovkin and all this other stuff. Right, but then you have no problem with ranking Jermell Charlo within your top 5 pound for pound. So is it really because Canelo you believe is super duper overrated, or is it because he's not, melanin? Let's be real. Is it because he has no melanin in his skin? Let's be real. It is what it is, and I'm not saying that there's not a part of you that believes that maybe he's not overrated. But if you believe that he's super overrated and then you're so delusional to the point to where you can't have someone like Jermell Charlo with the same standards and you immediately put him within your top 5 pound for pound, then what does that really say about you as an analyzer? It just is what it is. And, like I said, as for Terrence Bud Crawford, the biggest win of your career, and you have damn near 40 fights on your record, the biggest win of your career to this day is Sean Porter. And that's really the only definitive A-grade win that you have in your record. Like, that's a problem. I'm sorry. Now, if we're talking about old media, if we're talking about their pound for pound list, or maybe Ring Magazine, and certain people may not like me for saying this, I've already said it before, but it just is what it is. The most overrated fighter on their pound for pound list probably is Mr. Naoya Inoue. And certain people, would say, how could you say that, Inoue is the most dominant fighter in the world, blah, blah, blah. Once again, if I'm going to go in on Terrence Bud Crawford for not having any definitive A-grade names on his record, I have to do the same with Mr. Inoue. And certain people say, oh, you just don't watch those lower weight classes and blah, blah, blah. Listen, dude, I'm sorry, but I know a lot of fighters from those lower weight classes. Inoue has not fought a guy, in my view, that has ever clearly been on his same level. And certain people say, oh, well, Nonito Donaire, he was a former top 3 pound-for-pound fighter, right? And Sergey Kovalev, once upon a time, was a former top 3 pound-for-pound fighter. Does that mean that right now, that if someone gets to win over Sergey Kovalev, that they have to be immediately ranked in the top 10 pound-for-pound because once upon a time he was top 3? That doesn't make any sense. Nonito Donaire was not even top 20 pound-for-pound when Inoue beat him. Now, of course, he was able to beat some of the top guys there, but I don't think that either of those guys were really A-grade fighters either. And there's a reason why Inoue was able to dominate both of those fights and the passion that he did. Now, I believe that Inoue is a better fighter than what Donaire ever was. Just my personal view of it. But in the end, like who does he have on his record to where we can really say he's the number 1 pound per pound? Now, in terms of dominance, in terms of accomplishments, yeah, he's right there with anybody. But all Inoue is pretty much the Asian version of Terrence Bud Crawford. Not really comparing their skill sets too much. They're both very skilled. They don't really fight the same way. But, when it comes down to it, once again, that's pretty much what they are. Both Terrence Bud Crawford and Inoue, neither of them really have the best of resumes. But at least Terrence Bud Crawford has one definitive A-grade win in his career over Sean Porter, who I believe was still A-grade form. I don't think that any of the fighters that Inoue has ever fought in his career were ever for sure A-grade form. Just my personal view of it.
He chose the European assassin, Canelo Alvarez. I have to say, Teddy Atlas is one of the most unique members of old media. Because unlike the average old media member, Teddy Atlas, he breaks code. He does not stay on code. All of this stuff that Teddy Atlas said about Canelo Alvarez that I'm about to quote, everyone already knows this. But what race fans and old media don't usually do is say it in public. Teddy Atlas does, occasionally. Before Teddy Atlas completely committed to old media, he was extremely vocal about exposing Gennady Golovkin as the most overrated fighter at the time. Now he's exposing Canelo.
I'd have to see about that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I always thought that Teddy Atlas was on Gennady Golovkin's side. Now, I could be wrong about that, but I would have to see. But like I said, Teddy Atlas is a little bit of a double-edged sword. There's certain times where I think that he's very truthful, and there's certain times to where I think Teddy Atlas, I think that he always tries to be truthful, but there's times where I think he's a little bit too delusional. Like putting Lomachenko on the top 10 pound-for-pound list when he only has 2 fights. Like, come on. And that's where a lot of that hatred for Lomachenko came from, because they've seen a lot of old media or certain people already trying to put Lomachenko in a spot that he didn't deserve to be. And that's why so many of them, they did not really give Lomachenko the number 1 pound-for-pound ranking, because they said, you're just trying to push this dude. And I understand their perspective, but once again, no, Lomachenko was the true number 1 pound-for-pound fighter, at least there for about a year or two.
Alvarez. Now, this is not the first time that Teddy has exposed Canelo Alvarez. He's been exposing him for quite some time. But I believe this might be the first time that he just flat out came out and said, Canelo Alvarez is overrated and always has been.
I know you guys aren't mad at me saying that, are you? You great Mexican fans. I love yous, but you appreciate the truth. The truth, like you're great fighters, throw that.
Well, most people actually don't appreciate the truth, because the truth means swallowing a pill that a lot of the times can be very, very hard to swallow. And when it comes to fanboys, especially, no, they don't appreciate the truth, because what that means usually is certain criticism that they don't want to hear. And they take that criticism as a very big personal attack. Like if you ever say something criticizing about certain people, like some of the craziest fan bases that I've ever had, if you want to say the pleasure of dealing with, I guess, or the displeasure of dealing with, the Kobe Bryant fan base, the Allen Iverson fan base, the Deontay Wilder fan base, and certain other fan bases as well that maybe I'm forgetting. Like those fan bases, they're absolutely out of this fucking world crazy.
I've took to the liver, that's the truth. Well, there's other truths too. And the truth is that the man you love, I get it.
I represent Mexico.
And I appreciate that you back him and that you love him that way and you support him that way. But 2 things, and this is going to get, this probably get a few people's blood pressure up a little bit, Ken.
Not probably.
But it's early in the morning. We want to get the blood pressure up.
The hate will be flowing on Twitter, believe me.
But we'll stay consistent. and I stayed with my facts from my career for almost 50 years of what I see and what I believe. Doesn't mean I'm right, but I base it on experience and what I've noticed. Canelo has always been overrated. Now, it doesn't mean he's not a real good fighter. He is not the greatest Mexican fighter. He's overrated. He probably lost to Lara. He lost twice to Triple G. I know it's old news.
Well, according, to certain people with Lara, and don't get me wrong, I think that Lara could have potentially won that fight as well. But Lara, in my view, if he really also wanted to win that fight a little bit more definitively, he did have to throw a little bit more in that fight. And that's always been a little bit of an issue with Lara. It just is what it is. He's a very highly defensive fighter, but you can make him very uncomfortable. And Lara's been one of my favorite fighters for the past I don't know how many years. And I believe that he's going to have a fight recently against Danny Garcia, which is going to be a very interesting fight because that's probably going to be very big for both of their careers, even though, of course, they're both very much on the tail end of their careers. But that's a conversation for another time. But that fight, realistically, it was a fight that could have went either way. Yes, I thought in a lot of those rounds that Lara was getting the better of Canelo Alvarez. He did not show a great ability to cut off the ring. But Lara also, at times, in my view, he could have been more offensive. And he could have been a little bit more open. And in my view, you could debate that he gave away some of those latter rounds. So it is what it is. As for Gennady Golovkin, I certainly believe that Gennady Golovkin won the first fight against Canelo Alvarez. But the second one, no. Gennady Golovkin ended up blowing it. Canelo Alvarez ended up coming forward. He ended up showing a certain skill set that Gennady Golovkin was not comfortable with. And in the end, Canelo Alvarez was able to pull out of that fight. Probably, very close, 7-5, but he ended up winning that fight.
It's old history, but he lost the first two, especially the first one, to Drew. He lost to Mayweather every round, except for that judge that should be in jail.
I agree with that, and that's probably been the most definitive loss in Canelo Alvarez's career. But I don't really go super duper hard after Canelo Alvarez for that, because not really almost, well, excuse me, I shouldn't say almost. Nobody was really able to beat Mayweather in his career. Mayweather is debatably the greatest fighter of all time, so as long as you're not putting Canelo Alvarez in that conversation in the same, way with Mayweather or as the greatest fighter of all time, then I don't really have a huge problem with it. Because Canelo, of course, he hasn't really accomplished, quite enough, in my view, to be debatably in that conversation quite yet, at least with Floyd Mayweather Jr. But Canelo is an all-time great fighter. And if we do talk about all-time great Mexican fighters, and certain people may disagree, yes, Canelo is right there in terms of anyone, in terms of Mexican boxing history. And Dante, of course, he's going to get into that a little bit more. But at the end of the day, yes, Canelo is up there with anyone in terms of Mexican boxing history. He is a 4-weight division champion. He has defeated A-grade name after A-grade name for his era. He is very highly skilled, and on top of that, he's been severely dominant. So yes, Canelo, in terms of Mexican fighters, he's up there with anybody, Now, the only two names that I could really see possibly being over him would either be Chavez, maybe Salvador Sanchez, but I don't even think I can say Salvador Sanchez. I've heard, of course, about how skilled he was, but at the end of the day, he just doesn't have the accomplishments.
Let me just start by saying this, because I've been saying this forever on my channel. If you say that Canelo Alvarez is the greatest Mexican fighter of all time, what would that really be saying about Mexican fighters? You're doing Mexico a major disservice to say that Canelo Alvarez is the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. But I'll elaborate a lot more on that point on a separate video.
Well, once again, Dante and Ego especially, they always love to go in on this point saying like, oh, how can you say that Canelo is a great Mexican fighter? You're disrespecting Mexican fighters. Dude, who really is above Canelo Alvarez in terms of Mexican boxing history? Like I said, Chavez Sr., I could see. And if you want to put Salvador Sanchez there, okay, fine, I can maybe understand those too. But what are we really going to compare Marco Antonio Barrera, a guy that, lost to Manny Pacquiao twice, got his ass completely mollywopped in those two fights. A guy that also lost other fights to Junior Jones by knockout, lost to him twice. Like, we're going to compare Marco Antonio Barrera to Canelo Alvarez. Like, let's stop. Eric Morales, who lost to Marco Antonio Barrera, lost that trilogy, lost to Manny Pacquiao, lost to a multitude of other fighters. We're going to compare him to Canelo Alvarez. Let's stop. Juan Manuel Marquez, who, don't get me wrong, was probably the greatest, of that era, of the 2000s era. A guy that lost to Pacquiao multiple times, a guy that lost to Mayweather, a guy that lost to Timothy Bradley, a guy that I believe lost a couple of other fights. we're going to compare them to Canelo Alvarez? Absolutely not. I'm sorry, no. And don't get me wrong, all those guys, great Mexican fighters, great Mexican champions. None of them were Canelo Alvarez. And let me also state this. Oscar De La Hoya is not on the level of Canelo Alvarez either. I really don't know why Oscar De La Hoya always gets in these debates in terms of like the top 10 fighters of all time. And I always get, these fanboys of Oscar, these guys who wear high heels, or something. It must be, when it comes down to, that always say, oh, you don't know shit about Oscar. Oscar was great back in the day. Like, dude, what big fights did Oscar ever win? Like, he never won shit. Like, it just is what it is. He lost to Sugar Shane Mosley twice. Now, in my view, he should have won the second one, at least the last time, what I remember. But I'd have to rewatch the fight. He lost to Floyd Mayweather Jr. He lost to Felix Tito Trinidad, even though I probably would have given it to Oscar. But one could debate that he did blow away the last final 4 rounds. Of course, he ended up getting beat by Bernard Hopkins. I don't go against him too hard on that. But, like, at the end of the day, it's like, what really are the biggest wins in Oscar's career? Like, yeah, you ended up beating Chavez, but let's be real, dude. Like that's kind of like when, Terrence Bud Crawford beat Yuriorkis Gamboa. Like, that dude was nowhere near your same size. And Chavez, I believe, was starting to get a little bit older. Now, he was only 33 years old, but at the end of the day, Chavez never belonged at that weight class in the first place. He was clearly undersized. It just is what it is. And then you beat Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, a fight that, in my view, he probably should have lost, but another guy that was clearly not your same size. That's why I say, when it comes to Devin Haney, it's going to be very interesting, first of all, not only if he can beat Lomachenko, but how much longer he's going to last. Because I don't really, give you a super duper amount of credit if you're able to beat those smaller fighters, but you're not able to beat the guys your same size. Like, what does that really say about you? What that means is that when you finally fought guys that can handle your size and handle your athleticism, you failed. That's all that means. Like, Oscar De La Hoya, for sure, in my view, probably one of the more overrated fighters in boxing history. No doubt about it.
One of the things that I thought was pretty funny is DAZN, they actually wrote an article.
And if you're talking about other fighters that I believe are also overrated within the history of boxing, Mike Tyson is up there. I always see a certain amount of people try to defend Mike Tyson because he was the youngest heavyweight champion and his talent was phenomenal. Right, but there's so many guys to where their talent were phenomenal. Like, Lomachenko's talent is phenomenal. But at the end of the day, we have to take a look at the results. It just is what it is. Like, no offense against Mike Tyson, but who the hell did you ever beat? Like the most elite champions that he ever beat that weren't like 40 years old were like Frank Bruno and, I'm trying to think of who else, Michael Spinks. Like, those are the 2 best champions that he ever beat in his career. Like, are you kidding me? And then when it came to against Evander Holyfield and Lennox Lewis, you ended up getting your ass kicked in both of those fights. Like, the fights weren't even close.
What Teddy Atlas said.
But probably the most overrated fighter, in my view, at least throughout my time watching boxing, probably Bernard Hopkins. I've never seen a fighter get so much credit for whatever reason and get placed repeatedly within the top 10 of all time for really defeating nobody. And don't get me wrong, the man defeated Oscar De La Hoya and Felix Tito Trinidad. But after those wins, the wins really don't become that great. Like, who really did he beat in his career? And I get it that he lost some of those fights in his 40s, but he was also considered a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter, I believe, until about age 44. So at the end of the day, you have to win some of those big fights because certain fighters, they don't always age the same. So he ended up losing to Joe Calzaghe when that fight was looked at as 50-50. Many people say, oh, well, had Bernard Hopkins been younger, he would have beat Joe Calzaghe. No, he wouldn't have, because who did Bernard Hopkins ever really beat in his prime? His quote-unquote prime. Who did he ever beat when he was quote-unquote younger? He didn't beat anybody. Like, come on, man. Like, who did he ever beat? That was clearly A grade. Yeah, he could beat, the John Pascals. He could beat, overall certain fighters like Felix Tito Trinidad, who was about probably, 1.5 weight classes below him when it came down to it. Now, of course, Felix Tito Trinidad was still, a great middleweight fighter. But let's be real about this. Bernard Hopkins, was never really a true middleweight fighter. Whenever he fought someone, once again, just like Oscar, whenever he fought someone that was his own same size and could actually handle his skill set and his athleticism, he lost. That's why he lost to Jermaine Taylor twice. That's why he lost to Joe Calzaghe. That's why he lost to Roy Jones Jr. That's why he lost to those guys. I'm not even sure if Bernard Hopkins would have beat James Toney. Hands down, he's probably got to be the most overrated fighter that I've personally ever seen. Probably, just in my view.
The title of the article is Teddy Atlas names boxing superstar he thinks is overrated. And then they include the highlights of Canelo Alvarez beating John Ryder. And of course, the guy who's writing this article is making it sound like you would have to be seriously delusional to think that Canelo Alvarez is overrated in any kind of way. And this is what I was talking.
Well, in my view, you would somewhat have to be. Now, once again, if you're talking about him debatably being the greatest fighter of all time, then yeah, sure, maybe a little bit overrated in that sense. But if you're talking about Canelo as a great fighter, as an all-time great fighter, then yes, it would be delusional to say that he's not a great fighter. Once again, it reminds me a lot of the times when people that hated Mayweather, and that's not me saying that Canelo is on the same level as Mayweather, but that's just me saying that when you take a look at the fact that he's a four-weight division champion, and he didn't just, buy the four-weight division champion like what an Adrian Broner or what a Mikey Garcia did. He actually had to work to get his four-weight division belts. He actually had to do work when it came down to it. And on top of that, he's defeated A-grade name after A-grade name, and he's highly skilled. Yes, Canelo clearly is an all-time great fighter, no doubt about it.
Talking about when I said,
Another overrated fighter that ends up getting a lot of credit for whatever reason, Tommy Hearns. Tommy Hearns, for whatever reason, I also don't understand why people put him in conversations. Almost every big fight in his career, he ended up losing, especially against fighters that really could handle his athleticism, and really exposed somewhat of his leaky defense. But anyway.
That Teddy Atlas is one of the most unique old media members because he goes off code, which has clearly pissed off the other members of old media. I'll say this as well. The way that Teddy Atlas has been completely trashing fighters like Shakur Stevenson and has never really praised Devin Haney. Shakur Stevenson, he gets knockouts, and Teddy Atlas still calls him boring. But at the same time has never praised Gervonta Tank Davis or even a Deontay Wilder for being extremely exciting. Wouldn't that make some of you guys think that Teddy Atlas was going to say that someone like Shakur is the most overrated? Someone like Devin Haney? Someone like Gervonta Tank Davis? Someone like Errol Spence or Terrence Crawford? Teddy can't call any of those guys overrated. Sure, he can talk about how he personally...
Well, once again, Teddy Atlas, and I don't always agree with him, and I don't agree with him here, but one thing I give Teddy Atlas respect for is a lot like me. He doesn't really assign himself with anybody, and that's what happens when, you're a logical and objective thinker, at least, to a degree. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't agree with Teddy Atlas, but at least Teddy Atlas, in my view, once again, he's going to state whatever he thinks. He don't give a shit who likes it or who don't.
Doesn't like them, but he knows deep down when it comes to being the best in the sport that he has been involved in, as he put it, for 50 years, and has specialized in training fighters and breaking down fights analytically. Teddy knows he can't say the same things about Shakur Stevenson, Devin Haney, or Gervonta Tank Davis that he would say about Canelo Alvarez or Gennady Golovkin, because those type of fighters are going to go out of their way to prove Teddy Atlas wrong. Something fighters like...
Well, I think that you mean Shakur Stevenson and Devin Haney are going to go out of their way, because who the hell is Gervonta Tank Davis really willing to get in the ring with other than Ryan Garcia? It's no offense, but Isaac Pitbull Cruz and Rolly Romero, Rolly Romero just fought a 40-year-old the other day and damn near lost. Give me a break.
Golovkin and Canelo Alvarez could not do and would not do. This is the reason why Devin Haney is staying at 135 right now to fight against Lomachenko. Teddy Atlas, he said he put Lomachenko in his top 10 after his second fight. That's who Devin Haney is fighting this month. And guess what Teddy Atlas said about that fight? He said, man, that's going to be a hard fight. A really hard fight for Lomachenko to win. And he didn't blame it on size or age. He's attributing his prediction to Devin Haney's ability to control range, control distance. Now, sure, Teddy Atlas's co-host, he was trying to use old media talking points, trying to make excuses for Lomachenko, but Teddy Atlas, he wouldn't have it. When this guy was trying to tell Teddy how, oh man, but Devin Haney is so big, Teddy, he replied on his show by saying, everyone Lomachenko fights is big. And that's not a lie, because Nakatani was bigger than Devin Haney, bigger, taller. And Nakatani turned out to be Lomachenko's easiest fight. And I'm...
Right, and what that's basically Dante admitting, and some of these guys admitting, is that Lomachenko is not a natural 135-pounder. And that's not really an excuse, it's just, it is what it is. if you know anything, about Lomachenko and his build, or if you see him as a fighter, he's not a natural 135 pounder, but of course there's, certain people of course say, well, it's an excuse to say the size and it is. Well, what I'll say is this: if you're one of these guys, once again, that claim that Lomachenko was clearly going to beat Devin Haney or mollywop Devin Haney, like what Paulie Malignaggi was going on about, and then all of a sudden your energy changes now that the fight is actually about to happen, then yes, that would be somewhat, hypocritical. But to say that the size and, that the weight that is going to be an advantage, I don't think that that's really an excuse. I just think that it is what it is. Just like if we talk about John Jones in the UFC, John Jones used to always say about how people use the excuse about how he has such this long reach, and a height advantage. Well, it's not really an excuse. It's just that's a great virtue. That's a great virtue to have. It's a great physical advantage to have. Of course, you still have to have a great skill set. But when it comes down to it, of course, height and reach and weight, they're going to be an advantage. But Lomachenko, if he's on the level that a certain amount of people have alleged, then he should win this fight, because Devin Haney has certain faults in his, game plan as well.
Talking about one of Lomachenko's easiest fights of his career. So I already told you, it's pretty bold for Teddy Atlas to go against the grain and go off cold by saying the obvious, that Canelo Alvarez is the most overrated fighter today. Because I can guarantee you guys, there is not another fighter today that is fighting consistently that Teddy Atlas would say is more overrated than Canelo Alvarez. But let me tell you what really makes what Teddy Atlas said so ballsy. You'll also notice no black fighter has dared to even come close to implying that Canelo Alvarez is overrated. In fact, it's all...
Well, because a lot of black fighters, they have a great amount of respect for Canelo Alvarez, because they realize when you actually know shit about boxing that he's a great fighter. And that's why certain fighters like Devin Haney, both the Charlo brothers, Gervonta Tank Davis, certain fighters like that, why they've all said that he is a great fighter, period. But I'm not really going to go more into it. And don't get me wrong, that's not me saying that I've liked every move that Canelo has done in his career. But I'm not really going to go much further into the video, because it would just lengthen it when it doesn't really need to be. That's pretty much about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see, of course, what goes into Canelo Alvarez's career. But like I said, Canelo Alvarez, once again, he's already pretty much within my top 30 fighters of all time. He's on that same level with Ward, Bernard Hopkins, maybe a Tommy Hearns, probably even above a Tommy Hearns, to be quite honest with you. Certain fighters like that, he's at least on that level. Because when we talk about certain fighters like Oscar De, certain people will say, oh, you can't even compare him on that level. How could you say that? Well, let me ask you this. I have certain fighters like Oscar De La Hoya, Miguel Cotto, Juan Manuel Marquez, and Sugar Shane Mosley around that top 50 range. Is Canelo really below those fighters? Is that what you're telling me? A fighter that won the majority of his big fights, no matter what weight division he went up? Is that what you're telling me? You're telling me that Cotto and Mosley and Marquez, you tell me that those fighters, that they're above Canelo Alvarez? I'm sorry, I can't agree with that. It is what it is. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.